He followed the law and still ended up dead. On a cold Saturday in Minneapolis, January 24, 2026, Alex Pretty was killed by immigration agents while lawfully carrying a firearm. That's not speculation. That's how the incident was described in the first wave of reporting. Here's the paradox that should stop you cold. The same conduct that was legal seconds before the shooting became the justification after it. Pretty was described as a good Samaritan, yet almost immediately the federal government began treating his lawful gun carry as if it were proof of something darker. This matters to you because this story quietly redraws the boundary of when your rights exist and when they disappear. Not in theory, in real life, in a public space, with federal agents involved. The administration didn't hesitate. There was no public pause, no visible doubt. The narrative hardened fast, and it hardened in one direction. Here's the part nobody is saying out loud. This wasn't just about what happened on that street. It was about what had to be said afterward to protect someone else. And once that logic is accepted, the rules don't just change for Alex Pretty, they change for anyone standing where he stood. What actually happened that day has been described, but only partially. The public version focuses on an altercation, on split seconds, on federal agents making a decision under pressure. Alex Pretty was armed, yes, fact. He was lawfully carrying, yes, fact. But notice how quickly the story stopped being about sequence and started being about symbolism. This wasn't framed as one tragic encounter. It was folded into something bigger almost immediately. The administration treated the shooting as a test case, not an anomaly. Instead of asking whether lethal force was necessary, the response centered on defending the legitimacy of the agents involved. That choice matters. It signals that the priority wasn't clarity, it was closure. Fast closure, narrative closure. But here's where the pattern starts to emerge. When a government moves this quickly to define the meaning of an event, it's usually because the event threatens more than one interest at once. Law enforcement authority on one side, gun rights on the other, both central to the same political coalition. So ask yourself this. If this were truly straightforward, why did the framing need to lock in so fast? And why did it focus less on what agents did and more on what Pretty carried? Because once that shift happens, the story stops being about one man and starts becoming a rule. The claim that followed was simple and powerful. The shooting was justified because Alex Pretty was a threat. That assertion didn't hang in the air. It was anchored to a detail that kept repeating. Officials pointed to what he carried, not just a gun, but an extra magazine. Fact. Senior administration figures publicly suggested that this alone signaled danger. One official after another emphasized equipment, not behavior. Here's why that matters. Lawful gun carry, by definition, includes preparedness. An extra magazine is not unusual, it's common, but notice what they didn't say. There was no specific allegation that Pretty fired his weapon, no confirmed claim that he aimed it, no clear public account of him threatening agents in that moment. Instead, the focus stayed on possession. This is where the story quietly flips. The argument wasn't that Pretty did something illegal, it was that what he legally had made him inherently suspect. That's a different standard entirely. It reframes the right itself as conditional, fragile, dependent on how authorities interpret your intent after the fact. And here's the uncomfortable implication. If intent can be inferred from lawful equipment, then legality stops being a shield. It becomes evidence. That's not a small rhetorical shift. That's a structural one. And it didn't happen by accident. Once that logic is accepted, escalation becomes automatic. What began as a single shooting quickly turned into a broader rule about how armed civilians are treated around federal agents. The message wasn't delivered quietly. It was normalized in public statements. Approaching law enforcement while armed, even legally, was framed as inherently dangerous. This wasn't limited to Minneapolis. It was presented as common sense. Now watch how fast this escalates. A senior federal prosecutor went further, saying that if you approach law enforcement with a gun, there is a high likelihood they will be legally justified in shooting you. Fact. That statement doesn't describe a specific incident, it attempts to define a general rule of engagement. Historically, lawful carry has always rested on the idea that possession alone is not aggression. This flips that premise. Here's why that detail changes everything. It turns officer fear into legal authority. It normalizes preemptive force based on presence, not action. And once that becomes standard, it stops being exceptional. It becomes policy by habit. Notice what's being normalized here. Not restraint, not de-escalation, but the idea that constitutional rights quietly dissolve in proximity to federal power. And once that becomes routine, the next step isn't hard to predict. The reaction to that statement was immediate and more revealing than it first appeared. Major gun rights organizations condemned it. They called it dangerous. They called it wrong. Fact. But notice the contradiction that followed. The sharpest criticism landed on the prosecutor who said it, not on the administration that had already laid the groundwork for that logic. Here's the stronger evidence hiding in plain sight. While gun groups denounced the idea that lawful carry justifies being shot, top federal officials continued repeating the same framing in softer language. The equipment was still the focus. The intent was still questioned. The agents were still centered as victims of circumstance. Words and actions drifted apart. This is where the story permanently changes shape. Publicly, the administration claimed loyalty to gun owners. Operationally, it defended a killing by treating lawful carry as suspicious. That's not a messaging slip. That's a contradiction being managed in real time. Notice what didn't happen. There was no walkback from senior leadership, no clarification that lawful carry alone does not justify lethal force. Silence filled that gap. And silence, in moments like this, functions as permission. If the line had truly been crossed, it would have been corrected. Instead, it was absorbed, normalized, left standing. And once contradictions like this are allowed to stand, they don't stay isolated for long. What followed wasn't one decision. It was a stack of them, arriving fast. First, coordinated messaging from multiple federal departments. Fact. Law enforcement leadership closed ranks. Then the legal framing hardened, suggesting the presence of a firearm itself altered the rules. And almost simultaneously, the administration continued pushing separate legal challenges against state-level gun restrictions, as if nothing here conflicted. This is the pressure point, two tracks running at once. On one track, defending federal agents by narrowing the practical meaning of lawful carry. On the other, signaling support for gun rights by fighting blue state laws. The speed matters. There was no pause to reconcile the contradiction, no slowdown to let public concern breathe. This is how control slips, not through one dramatic announcement, but through momentum. Each statement made the next one easier. Each justification reduced the space for reconsideration. And every hour that passed without correction locked the logic in a little deeper. What happens if this continues? If every armed interaction becomes presumptively threatening? If legality only survives until it collides with federal authority? At some point, the system stops reacting and starts assuming. Now bring this back to yourself. Strip away the politics, the statements, the press briefings. Imagine standing in a public space, legally armed, doing nothing illegal. Fact. That is exactly how Alex Pretty was described before the shooting. The shift happens after. Once something goes wrong, your presence is reinterpreted, your intent is reassessed, your legality is reweighed. Here's the lived consequence. You don't get to explain yourself in hindsight. You don't get the benefit of clarification once force is used. The standard becomes emotional, not legal. Fear replaces statute. And that doesn't just affect activists or edge cases. It affects ordinary people who carry because they believe the law allows it. Notice how this changes behavior. People hesitate to intervene. They hesitate to help. They hesitate to exist in public while armed, even when permitted. The chilling effect isn't theoretical, it's psychological. It spreads quietly. Residents in Minneapolis didn't describe feeling reassured after the shooting. They described feeling fear. That detail matters, because when lawful behavior becomes risky, trust erodes from the ground up. If this feels familiar, say so in the comments, because this isn't about ideology. It's about how safe you feel exercising a right you were told was protected. To understand why this keeps happening, you have to look past outrage and into incentives. Federal agencies are designed to protect themselves first. When an armed civilian dies in an encounter with agents, the system doesn't ask, "What went wrong?" It asks, "How do we prevent liability?" That single question explains almost every move that followed. Here's the unsettling insight. Rights are treated as flexible when they interfere with enforcement. Lawful carry is respected in the abstract, celebrated in speeches, defended in court filings against states, but in a live encounter, it becomes a variable to manage. A risk factor, something to neutralize rhetorically after force is used. This isn't chaos. It's structure. Bureaucracies survive by minimizing exposure, not by honoring principles. The fastest way to shield agents is to reframe the civilian as a threat. The fastest way to do that is to pathologize what they carried instead of examining what agents did. This is why the messaging felt coordinated. It wasn't about persuasion, it was about stabilization. Freeze the narrative, narrow the question, protect the institution. And once you see that mechanism, the story stops being confusing, it becomes predictable, which is what makes what comes next far more important than what already happened. From here, the trajectory splits, and neither path is clean. One possibility is quiet absorption. The outrage fades. The language sticks. Lawful carry remains protected on paper, but in practice, armed proximity to federal agents is treated as a presumptive threat. No formal policy change, just a new baseline enforced through fear and precedent. That's the path of least resistance. The other path is slower, messier, and harder to control. Legal challenges, public pushback, pressure from interest groups that can't ignore the contradiction forever. If courts are forced to weigh in, the administration loses control of the framing. What was once a narrative defense becomes a legal liability. But here's the key detail. Momentum already exists. The administration chose its initial response quickly, and reversals at this stage are costly. Acknowledging overreach risks exposure, doubling down risks alienation. Neither option is painless. So the next move won't come from a podium. It will come from silence, from selective enforcement, from which cases get defended and which quietly disappear. The direction is forming even now, whether anyone announces it or not. And that uncertainty is the most revealing part of all. Here's the insight that ties all of this together. The fight was never really about Alex Pretty. It was about who gets the benefit of doubt when power and rights collide. In this case, the answer was immediate. The institution was protected. The individual was reframed. A man described as a good Samaritan became a threat after he was dead. Lawful carry became suspicious only once it needed to be. And a coalition built on shared principles revealed how elastic those principles really are under pressure. This story isn't finished, because the logic used here doesn't stay contained. It gets reused, refined, quietly expanded. The next case won't look identical, but the reasoning will feel familiar. The real signal isn't what officials said on camera. It's what they didn't undo afterward. That silence tells you how future encounters will be interpreted. If you want to understand how power actually behaves, not how it's advertised, stay with this story. Follow the next one, because the pattern is now visible.